Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 19. The name of this build is Master Chief. This is going to be another small form factor build and it's going into the Bitfenix Prodigy. I've done a number of Prodigy builds, but this build is going to be very unique. It's a theme build and I'm going to take the theme and the mods really further than I ever have before. This build is going to have extensive case mods, custom components, custom paint, cables. Just about everything is going to be customized. There's a lot of work going into the mods for this build. So really the main focus for this build is on the theme and the mods. A lot of the components are from the client's previous build. So we have here the Asus Maximus 6 Impact, the Intel Core i7 4770K, 32 gigabytes of Corsair Dominator Platinum. It's actually 16 gig. The client has removed 2 sticks. We have the Silverstone Strider 600 watt, an EVGA GTX 980, and 2 Samsung 840 EVO 250 gigabyte SSDs. For the water cooling components, we have 2 Hardware Labs Black Ice GTS 240s. We have 2 EK Nickelplex ECSQ clean water blocks, one for the motherboard and one for the graphics card. Now you can see we have 2 DDC pumps. Something that the client really wanted in this build was dual loops. It's unnecessary, obviously, for a build of this size, only cooling the CPU and graphics card, but purely as part of the theme and for the aesthetics, it is something that I might do as long as the build doesn't end up too crowded. There's really not a lot of space to work with. So we have, for the radiator fans, Noise Blocker Black Silent Pro PL2s, and for the DDC pumps, Bits Power mod tops, mod kits, and upgrade kit 150s. The case mods and custom paint are now complete, although there is still custom panels and components to be added to the case. Unfortunately, I was unable to film this part of this build due to what was happening at SingularityComputers during this time. Some of you know that a lot has been happening behind the scenes. Now, the theme for this build, Master Chief actually has 2 meanings for this build. A rank in the US Navy because the client is a Navy veteran, and Master Chief from Halo. So the theme is a mixed Navy, military, and Halo theme. And the idea that we decided to go for the build is a portable piece of military hardware that's used out in the field. So it's strong and tough, and it gets really knocked around. So you will notice the weathering. Now, as you can see, the case has been heavily modified. We've welded on a new front panel and top panel with 240mm radiator mounting positions. Once you install the radiator onto the top panel, the rear fan mounting position becomes useless, so mainly for aesthetics, I welded another panel over this area to blank it off. We've modified the side panels, cut out side panel windows, removed the front I/O, power and reset buttons, and changed the way that the side panels fit onto the case. When you remove the plastic case feet from the Bitfenix Prodigy, underneath is holes, slots, and recessed areas on all 4 corners of the case, which are highly visible and ugly, and it's a real barrier to removing these case feet, because once you do, it requires extensive mods to cover them up. We actually welded curved or rolled aluminium panels onto all 4 corners of the case, and then it required a lot of work to streamline these curves into the case, so grinding, sanding, and filling to cover up those welds. And because we did so much welding, we decided to seam weld the entire case, so everything except for the motherboard tray, which I wanted to keep somewhat removable, so that part of the case is still riveted into position. But everything else, instead of the rivets that this case has, the stock case, it's all been seam welded. So this case is now solid. It's incredibly strong, has no movement or flex, it's rigid. Unlike cases that are riveted together, which have a lot of movement and flex in them. So, this fits the theme and the idea for the build nicely and also increases the quality. If you take a look at the inside of the case, you can see that the corners are curved. All of the welds that we've done have been ground back and streamlined into the case. For the custom paint for this build, we started with a layer of black because we knew we were going to be doing some weathering. Everything else has been airbrushed over the top. So grey, silver, white, black, blue, and red, and variations of these colors, the alien runes, the text, and weathering is really just common sense. Some of it is done while the paint is still a little bit wet. scuffs, chips and scratches. Some of it goes all the way down to that original black, which is what that is for. And you know, the weathering is subtle, but it's an important part of the theme. I was going to go with a matte finish for this build as part of the theme, but I decided to go with a gloss finish because, you know, it just gives the paint job a bit more depth and I much prefer it. Now, these case feet are from MNPC Tech and they're an incredible looking component, billet alloy, which is really going to match up with this build nicely because there's a lot of billet alloy components going into this build. I'll put a link in the video description to where you can pick these up from. The Hardware Labs Black Ice GTS 240 comes in a black wrinkle coat option, and we've gone straight over that original paint job with a titanium silver and then lightly scuffed it back with Scotch-Brite. And this is really going to suit the theme perfectly. It's an interesting paint job, the black wrinkle coat, and you know, this just gives you some ideas of different effects that you can create with this. You know, imagine if you went over this with a couple of different semi-transparent paints, scuffed it back to expose the tops of the wrinkle coat, and you know, then went over it with clear coat and actually leveled it out with a really thick clear coat. You could create some amazing effects. I've prepared the rest of the components ready for installation, so you can see I've installed the motherboard water block, the EK Nickel Plexi CSQ clean monoblock onto the Asus Maximus 6 impact. This also fits onto the Maximus 7 impact, and I've used this in a previous build. I'm very impressed with the design. The internal layout and flow has been very well thought out and the performance is excellent. I have a mod in mind for the memory, which you're going to see coming up. You can also see I've installed the graphics card, water block and backplate onto the GTX 980. The pump and reservoir configuration for this build consists of the Swiftech MCP35X, Bits Power Acrylic DDC Pump Top, Bits Power Acrylic DDC Upgrade Kit 150, and a Bits Power DDC Pump Cooler. Now, this is actually was the gold version, so it was anodized gold, and I chose this because gold is going to be part of the color scheme for this build. There is going to be, you know, a couple of gold accents, but because there's a lot of billet alloy components going into the build, I decided to strip it back to bare metal and polish it. What you're looking at here is the SingularityComputers lathe and mill in action, and we're building a custom dual reservoir mount for this build. Now, it turned out that the only way dual loops were going to work is if I installed one pump and res config on one radiator and one on the other. So that would mean one pump and res config would be horizontal. And I wasn't going to do that just for the sake of installing dual loops in a build where it wasn't necessary. I wanted to have them side by side so that it was symmetrical. You know, it just would have fit the theme better, but they weren't going to fit there, mainly due to the limited inlet outlet options on the DDC pump and res config, and also the inlet outlet positions on the radiator, and most of all the limited amount of space. And you know, once you install the cables and everything else, it's really was going to end up far too cramped, so I decided to drop back to a single loop. So this is the reservoir mount that we ended up with, and some of you will recognize this because this is the original SingularityComputers core reservoir mount, which is now available on the SingularityComputers store. The mass production version has a number of improvements and upgrades over this original design, and it's built using a far more accurate and high quality manufacturing process. It is still a billet alloy component though, which means that it's carved from a solid piece of alloy, which is a very strong, high quality and expensive way of building something. The aesthetic that I was going for, to fit the theme, I wanted something strong, heavy and industrial looking. So, you know, that's why I went for the double clamps. You know, there's a lot of material in this mount, and you'll notice the extra mount on the side, which is on the final design. It was included specifically for this build though, to mount the SSDs next to the radiator and fans, although it can be used for mounting just about anything. So I'm going to build an SSD mounting plate which will mount directly onto the side of the reservoir mount there. You can see the two clamps have a slightly different design, and that was only on this original version to allow more room for the cables in the build. Now I could easily have plated or anodized this reservoir mount with our plating and anodizing systems, but to fit the theme and because there's so many alloy components going into this build, bare alloy, I decided to polish it to a mirror finish and leave it bare. It does take a lot of time and effort to polish alloy to a mirror finish like this, but you can see that I did 24 karat gold plate the tubes between the two mounts. There is going to be a few gold plated components in the build just as a small accent. Now, most importantly, so you're looking at the final mass production version of the mount here. Something I've been doing for years is mounting pump and res configs, reservoirs and other components to radiators. And up until now, the only way this has been possible is with UN mounts, which come in a 120mm and 140mm version. And you know, a lot of you will have seen me use UN mounts many times previously to do this. Well, with all SingularityComputers reservoir mounts, they come with a universal mounting plate, which allows you to mount the pump and res config or the reservoir directly to just about any radiator. So 120mm all the way up to 480mm and 140mm all the way up to 560mm. Now, because this mount has dual clamps, you know, that's not just for aesthetics. It does give the mount a lot of extra strength. And on a small reservoir tube like this one, a very small pump and res config, the mount looks massive. And I did want that for this build as part of the theme. But it's very good for larger pump and res configs, you know, even right up to 400mm reservoir tubes, because it gives you the extra strength. With a single clamp mount, you know, you're going to start getting a lot of movement even when you get up to, say, a 250mm reservoir tube. So I've now installed the motherboard, fans, radiators, and also the pump and res config with the custom reservoir mount. And you can see that I've added something else to the case, the radiator shrouds, which is just another small addition as part of the theme to increase the detail of the case. Something that we decided in the beginning was to really create as much detail in this build as possible. So you can see what the pump and res config looks like installed with the custom mount, and also the custom paint on the GTS 240s. It all matches up nicely, and with a couple of other gold components, accents around the build, the 24 karat gold bladed tubes are really going to stand out nicely. So you can see the difference between the two clamps and how that gives me a little bit more room for the cables when they come out of the back of the power supply. So that was fairly important for this build. You can also see that dual loops would have just been far too cramped. You know, if I were to install a horizontal pump and res config at the top, it would have been almost touching the motherboard. We're now working on the front panel for the case. So this is another billet alloy component. It's built from 10mm alloy sheet, 6061 alloy. So it does look very heavy, but you know, it's a lightweight alloy, and by the time we've finished milling it, there's not going to be a whole lot of material left, so it will end up very lightweight. You can see that we've designed it to look a bit like a heatsink. We've made cuts all the way around the outside. We're also drilling holes at a 45-degree angle on 3 sides, and you know, this is all for aesthetics, but also a little bit for ventilation, although we are going to be mounting this front panel about 10mm off the front of the case, so there'll be plenty of room for ventilation for the front radiator. There's also the ventilation at the bottom. When I was designing this build with the client, the front panel very quickly became the main feature of the build, and the build just became incredibly detailed. This is going to be really the exact opposite of the aesthetic that I personally prefer to go for and that I normally go for my builds. So, you know, instead of a subtle, understated aesthetic, it's the exact opposite. It's highly detailed. I mean, even just what you've seen so far, but there's a lot more to come. And what's being done here now is some airbrushing for the front panel. This is a full high detail art piece of Master Chief, and it's actually being done on acrylic. And you'll see why we're doing this onto acrylic later in the build log, but it's not something that I normally do. I don't usually paint or airbrush onto acrylic, but there was many layers done. A massive amount of time went into this art piece. Some of the layers on the back of the acrylic and some of them on the front, which may give you a bit of a clue as to what we're actually going to do with this front panel. But you can see it is now complete, and the art piece is laid into the front panel. It's not actually fitted into position yet, but this is what's going on the front of the build. And something like this could easily have turned out to be a disaster. I mean, just putting a big art piece on the front panel. But with the detail, the effort that we have here, I mean, this full billet front panel carved from a, solid 10mm sheet with high detail, polished to a mirror finish. Just the shaping and polishing, the final shaping that I did by hand of this front panel alone took about a day and a half. And there is days of work that went into the art. So I'm really looking forward to fitting this onto the case and showing you the other additions that are coming to this build. But that's it for this part of the build log. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.